Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca,
And I'm Landon.
and we are so excited to be able to bring this episode to you guys, aren't we, Landon?
We are. This is a special episode with a very important guest, Matt Harris.
Matt Harris, that's right. And so this episode is a little different, which is why we're doing this little promo here. This actually was a meeting of our The Good Book Club. And we read, I don't know if you have your copy, Landon, but I have my copy right here, Second Class Saints for the book club the month of January. And Matt Harris, the author, was so gracious, and we invited him on. And typically, when we have authors on, we're like, no, we talk for 2 hours, but you can just come in, as long as you want. So some of them will give us half an hour. These are very busy people. Matt goes, I'm in. He goes, I'm in for the whole 2 hours, and he wasn't kidding. He was. And we had this incredible panel discussion where the members of our book club were able to ask Matt questions about kind of inside info on writing the book and his sources and all of that. Anything else you want to mention about that, Landon? Just so fascinating.
Yeah, this wasn't us asking questions. In fact, you weren't even able to attend.
Yes,
Uh,
let's say I wasn't. I had a medical and still continue to have a medical dental incident. By the time this airs, my oral surgery will be over and I should be back to normal. So, but yeah, I couldn't even go. I was like laying down, kind of listening in the background, but Landon was there running the whole show on the Good Book Club.
yeah, and normal is kind of a.
Oh, thank you, Landon. Thank you. I'm just hoping nobody notices the golf ball size,
Well, now that you pointed out,
infection. Yeah. I thought about logging on and going, hello, everyone. Welcome to more. But I thought they already probably think I'm really weird, and that's even weirder. But anyway, we're dealing with it. It's okay. The bottom line is the book club must go on. Mormonish must go on. So Landon ran the whole show today. And go ahead and just mention a few things, and then we'll get right into it.
Well, it was really just a Q&A, so the members of our book club were able to ask any questions they wanted to Matt about his book, which is fantastic. It's a fantastic book. So we just wanted to let people ask questions, and we thought the discussion was worth posting as an episode.
Yeah, I feel like anytime you have Matt Harris all to yourself for 2 hours, there's no way that you don't put that out to a wider audience. That's how I feel about it, because he is just incredible. He's a wonderful human being and an incredible scholar. And I've said it over and over, and so have other podcasters. This book is so pivotal to understanding not only this issue, but the inner workings of the church during that era where a lot of us were growing up. It's just, there's a reason Mormon Stories did how many episodes on it?
40 hours or
Yeah,
something.
I mean, yeah, it's pretty incredible.
And
So,
obviously, the issue we're talking about is the race ban in the
yep,
LDS Church. So,
yep, that's right. And that's why it's called Second Class Saints, Black Mormons, and the Struggle for Racial Equality. So, again, this is a good book club meeting. So, we wanted to do this little promo to show you or explain to you that it might be a little bit different format, but I think you'll really appreciate the questions from a lot of our members. A lot of our members in the book clubs are also, fans and viewers and listeners of Mormonish. So it's all in the family. But again, if anyone's interested in joining our book club, it's virtual, very easy to join. And it's every second Sunday at 11 a.m., just a Zoom meeting. And we often have authors on like Matt Harris, and we have a book a month that we read. So I'll put some links in the show notes if anybody's interested in joining us, because we have I think 1,000 members all over the world. I mean, it's pretty incredible, pretty fun. So, all right, enough of us. Let's turn the time over right now to Matt Harris, and let's enjoy this incredible panel discussion with super smart book club members and Matt Harris telling us all about writing Second Class Saints and everything that's in it.
we're going to get started today with Second Class Saints by Matthew Harris. Ron Jorgensen will be kind of leading the discussion, and the intent is to have this be a question and answer period. I got to tell you, Matt, I read your book. I was reading it on a flight to Japan, and it's like a 10, 12-hour flight. I never slept. I just read your book. I couldn't put it down. I was fascinated. I was upset. I was, it was, this to me is one of the best post, one of the best books on Mormon history that I've read. It is just fantastic. Really enjoyed it. And I think other people are going to have the same thing. And I think the reason it resonated so much with me was because I knew all the people in the book. These are the names of the general authorities I grew up with. And these are the men that I was taught were, God's representatives here on earth. And so when I saw kind of the how the sausage was made behind the scenes, I was going, "Oh wow, this is really the people I looked up to." It was tough to go through. So we'll go ahead and get started. But I want to start out first, Matt, by asking you a question, and then we'll let Ron start. Kind of running with things. If you have any questions, what you do, just raise your hand and Ron will call on you and we'll let you ask questions. There are a couple things that we want to make sure is this is about the book. So it's not about Matt or his beliefs. So please make sure your questions are about the book and pointed to questions in the book. And please keep them short enough and relevant questions to allow everyone a chance to ask questions. But Matt, I wanted to ask you right off the bat. I mean, this is a charged subject, obviously, for both Latter-day Saints and non-Latter-day Saints, and especially for people in the Black community. Um, this had to be a delicate topic to take on and a challenging topic, and you must have gotten a lot of pushback and a lot of feedback on some of the things that you said. What made you want to write this book, and what drove you to go to this topic and to get the sources that you had that were so good?
Yeah, thanks, Lan. That's a great question. Thanks to everybody for being here today. I always count myself fortunate when I'm able to be in the presence of Latter-day Saints and other people. So, well, I grew up in the faith. I went to BYU. I served a mission. And, as a missionary, I know some of the folks on this panel today have served missions. And, you come up close and personal with people of color who ask about the ban. And I served a mission in Idaho. So I'm from Maine, and you guys all have permission to laugh. I went to Idaho, but I'm going to brag up Idaho. It was a terrific experience. Anyway, so I'm a naive, clueless Maine boy who's the proud holder of an early morning seminary certificate. I think I slept through 70% of it like my classmates, our poor teachers. Anyway, I'm trying to get teenagers, interested in the Old Testament at 5:30 in the morning. Good luck with that. Anyway, but I did have a broad base in the church. And of course, like most of us on this panel today, I didn't know anything about the ban, and I heard the same things that we all heard that, we don't understand why, that just God denied certain people privileges in the scriptures. So it is today with Black people. And later on, of course, I would come to realize that all of those rationales were completely absurd. But at the time, you just sort of drank it and swallowed it. And so I went on my mission in Idaho, and my first area in Pocatello, we had an African American man, graduate of Stanford University, and he asked us about the ban. And I felt completely powerless. I didn't know anything. And later I got to my companion, and we got home that night, and I asked my senior companion. So I was brand new. And I said, boy, I didn't feel like we did very well with his questions. And he said, well, the truth is the truth. And he pulls out Mormon doctrine and invokes, that Black people are cursed. And I just remember thinking, that's just absurd. As a 19-year-old unquestioning Latter-day Saint young man, even then I thought it was absurd. And then my sister married a Peruvian man who had dark skin. And I remember asking my father, I said, why is it okay for Becky, my sister, to marry my brother-in-law with dark skin, but yet she can't marry a Black man? And my dad, bless him, gave me the Spencer Kimball line, marriage is hard enough, and all this stuff. And I said, well, wait a minute. He's from Peru. Don't give me this cultural difference with African Americans. My goodness, what is it? So anyway, to answer your question, Landon, I had those experiences lingering in the background. And when I got to BYU, which is where I took a BA and an MA, I started reading a little bit more. And then during my master's program, one of my professors said something insightful. He pulled me aside and he said, don't ever do Mormon history. It's like quicksand. Once you're in, you cannot get out. And so I listened to him. His name was Carl Marlowe, the late Carl Marlowe. I listened to Professor Marlowe. And then finally, about 15 years into my career, I merged to the dark side, and I've been in the quicksand ever since. And my first book, Landon, was on the Black Latter-day Saints. I did it in 2015 with the scholar Newell Bringhurst. And I realized that in that book that I had so much material that I had compiled that I couldn't use. And I also realized that I wanted to tell a very detailed and nuanced story about how the band was made, how others looked at the band. And that was the result of my second book on this topic, which is the one we're talking about today. I won't be as long-winded, I promise.
All right, we got a couple of questions here. iPhone Jackie, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes. So appreciative to be here with you, Matt. I really appreciate it. And I'm a huge fan, and I so appreciate your scholarship. And I listened to every minute you did on Mormon stories, all of those wonderful hours. And I read the book, and I found it interesting that you need both. You need to listen to both to get all the information, because the book has information that didn't come out in the discussions. And so really feel appreciative. But I have a few questions, but the one I think I want to ask is that as I read your book, like when you gave all your discussions on Mormon stories, you had a lot more time to develop your stories in the background and humanize. And in the book that, I know your editors are keeping you at a, really tight amount of numbers, it really hit me hard how painful all of this has been for the Black people who have been members of this church. It was like a barrage. It's just boom, 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 boom. And the patterns really jumped out through the book. And one pattern I saw is that it seemed like the brethren, when they didn't know what to do, they went on a PR blitz. When in doubt, go on a PR blitz. It's like kind of like our recent history, I'm a Mormon campaign. Can you give us any more detail on why you think they would go for this PR blitz? And was it ever effective? Did it ever work?
Well, so the church's public relations department was born out of the church's anti-Black theology. And as you know, Jackie, from my episodes on Mormon stories and also my book, that the church was coming under heavy fire from the civil rights movement. And I mean, Spencer Kimball, Elder Kimball writes in his diary in 1969, he says, "We're coming under attack. Daily, we're reading unflattering newspaper stories about the church." And so that's born out of the BYU racial protest in particular. And so they create the church PR department in the early 70s, and they consult with a public relations firm, I think out of Chicago. And the whole idea was they wanted to feed the news media positive stories about the church. And they do that in any number of ways, including finding a faithful Black Latter-day Saint person to be sort of the church's PR person. And it's just quite simple that, hey, look, I'm African American, I'm a Mormon, I'm happy, I have a testimony, what's the problem? So that's the PR that they use. Does it work? Depends on who you're talking to. If it's to the saints, yes, it's effective. We're not bigots. Look, we've got a Black person in the church. But if it's to people outside of the church, including the dozens of universities who wanted to kick BYU out of the Western Athletic Conference because of the school's racist policies, it doesn't work at all because they see right through the PR blitz. In fact, in November of 1969, they were the WAC, the Western Athletic Conference, they were scheduled to have a vote to kick BYU out. And they had the numbers. They were going to boot them out. And Ernest Wilkinson tried the PR blitz with his fellow presidents, and one of whom was a guy named Joseph Ray from UTEP, University of Texas at El Paso, which was in the conference. And Joseph Ray wrote back Ernest Wilkinson. He said, "Don't try this PR garbage on us. We're going to watch how many African American athletes you recruit and how many students that you allow into your university. That's what we're going to watch. In other words, we're going to watch your feet, not your mouth." And so when Wilkinson recognized that the PR blitz wasn't working, And I should also tell you, they sent the BYU student body president, a guy named Brian Walton, to visit certain universities as well. They sent Darius Gray and Heber Woolsey. So they sent representatives, emissaries out to soften the racism. But when they recognized that wasn't working, that's when Ernest Wilkinson went to the Brethren in the fall of 1969. They said, "Look, we can't do this anymore. They're not buying what we're selling. We need to admit and recruit African Americans. We can't continue to harbor discriminatory policies like we've done in the past." That's the exact language he used. We cannot continue to harbor discriminatory policies like we have in the past. So they saw right through it, and with the help of the new church PR machine in Salt Lake, they continued to forge on, but they also recognized they had to change policies lest they get kicked out of their conference. Great questions.
Thank you.
Yeah,
right.
Thank you.
It was that was really interesting to me when I saw how much the college athletics. If you want to bother the brethren, get BYU's athletics involved because that really made a change quick. And Wilkinson, that was pretty interesting, that whole side of things, with how he handled things. And he pointed out that he was a lawyer, not a theologian, and he had to make this argument for the church, and you could tell he knew it was a losing argument, but he made it anyway. So.
Yeah.
But I think Martine.
No. Brian's next.
Martine.
Brian is next.
Oh, Brian.
Yeah.
Brian, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Matt, thank you so much for your book. One of the things I was so impressed with is for writing this book, you seem to have unprecedented access to First Presidency meeting notes, journals from Spencer W. Kimball and others. And I just like to ask you if there's kind of a story or information about how you were able to get that access, because it's so impressive to me that you were trusted to have that. I mean, it's really kind of almost a landmine field when you're writing about an era of history that from our modern perspective today, there's really no way to write kind of a flattering writing about this era of history. But yet you were trusted with these sources to write this important history.
Yeah. So how did I get access to all this stuff? And a couple of three ways. One is I got access by building relationships with some of the church archivists. And I got access, for example, to the Joseph Fielding Smith papers, which nobody had ever seen before, and lots of other collections of the church archives. I or anybody else could not get that same access today. There's been a clampdown at the church archives. And somebody said, "Was it your book?" And I said, "No, it wasn't my book. The clampdown started before my book." So, but there was an archivist who's now retired that I worked with extensively, and I'll leave names out today. But this archivist, I just formed a relationship with him, and I told him, like I tell everybody else, when you entrust material to me that's confidential and private, I will not share it. I can't tell you how many times I've turned down fellow scholars over the years, including even BYU faculty, who wanted some of the material that I had. And I said, it's privileged. It was shared just with me in confidence. I can't share it with you. However, I can point you to the person you need to talk to so that you can form that relationship. So I maintain confidences, and that's one of the reasons, Brian, why I get the material that I do. And I've never shared anything to this day that I don't have permission to share. Other things that are not restricted, I share all the time, but the restricted stuff, never. So I form relationships with the church archivists. The second one is I form relationships with the adult children of the general authorities, whose papers that they inherited when their late father passed. And I'll share just two quick stories. One is the gold standard, of course, was Spencer Kimball. And I remember calling his son, Ed Kimball, years ago. Ed, some of you may know that Ed wrote two wonderful biographies on his father's presidency. I'm not a fan of, sons or daughters writing about their parents just because you can't be objective. But nonetheless, I think Ed wrote the best biography that to this day Desert Book has ever published. And so Ed is not just the son of his father, he was also a biographer. So he was connected to this story in two ways. And so I remember calling Ed, and he was just grilling me on the phone about any number of things, about who I was, why do you want my father's papers? And, can you blame the guy, right? I'm asking to see the most sensitive things about his family. And when you're looking for things about race and the priesthood ban, my topic, you're seeing family squabbles. You're seeing, the disappointment that Spencer Kimball had in some of his children when they didn't behave a certain way. You're seeing his oldest son, Levan Kimball, um, you're seeing Spencer's reaction to his leaving the church. You're seeing all of this stuff. So I had to convince Ed that I was worthy of this really precious family heirloom. And if 3 phone calls weren't enough to win him over, he invited me to Provo. And since my in-laws live in Provo, that was an easy thing to do. So the next time I was in town, I went over to Ed's house, which was by the old Provo temple up on the bench. I guess it's been demolished now. Some of you may know. But anyway, so I went over to Ed's house, and I didn't know what I was going to expect. We had spent several hours on the phone already. Like, what is he going to ask me? Well, anyway, he wanted to see me in person, and I think I won him over in the first 30 minutes of the interview. I mean, he knew where my heart was. He knew that I was trying to be as authentic to the story as possible. And we stayed for he fed me 2 meals. He was just so generous and kind. And after about 8 hours of being there, his daughter was in the room, lovely woman. And after about 8 hours of being there, I was getting ready to leave, and Ed reached down into a briefcase and he pulled out a stack of documents. And he said, I did not donate these to the church history library. I should add parenthetically, he had already donated his father's papers to the church history library. I thought that he still had them in his possession. And I did not know that until I got there that day. And boy, wasn't I disappointed. But anyway, when I found out that he would facilitate my access to the church archives, that he would go to bat for me, because that was not an open collection. And so anyway, as I left that day, Ed gave me a stack of documents that he did not donate with the other papers. And some of you are curious what those papers are. If you read chapter, I think it's 9 in my book, where it talks about Elder McConkie embellishing the revelation, all of that stuff, those are the papers he gave me. And obviously, somebody asked recently, why did he give those papers to you? Well, it's clear he wanted me to use that in my book, right? He wasn't just saying, hey, have a look at this. This is pretty interesting. He was basically saying, I trust you to write about something so sensitive that I could never write about. And anyway, writing for Desert Book. So he did that, and he wrote an email to the archivist, and he said, I want Matt Harris to have full access to my father's papers as it relates to his topic. And so I saw his diaries that are unredacted. So any of you can go online to the Church History Library webpage, and you can see Spencer Kimball's diaries that were published, I think, a year and a half ago. And some of them are heavily redacted. And so I was privileged to see all the redacted parts and what they took out and all of that. So I would say probably half the diary entries in my book that are from his papers collection are redactions. So you realize that I wouldn't pass up the juicy stuff, right? So
that was one of the most incredible parts of the book when I read that McConkie and that Jesus appeared. I think that wasn't McConkie. That was
Packer.
Packer. Yeah, Packer that said that. And wow, it was just like, oh wow, that that tells me a lot that maybe I suspected in the past but didn't know. So even though it just related to this, it really was eye-opening, when they said, oh, Jesus was there, all the past presidents of the church. And then you read the meeting minutes and what really happened, and you just go, wow, this is really quite embellished. So that was really a strong part of the book.
Let me just say one more thing to the group, Landon, that I just want to give a shout out to the late Ed Kimball. And he was a believing Latter-day Saint to the day he died. He passed, I think, a handful of years ago. I'm sorry that he didn't get a chance to see my book come to fruition. But Ed was so generous to me. He didn't just facilitate access to his father's papers, but he also gave me his own diaries. And those of you who've read my book already and heard some of the podcasts, you'll know that he's part of the story, where he talks about, there's a great part in my book where Ed is asked to go meet with Elder McConkie to rebuke him for not taking out that little phrase that bothered President Kimball, which was, "We all heard the same voice," implying erroneously that we heard a voice when they lifted the ban. And Spencer Kimball was angry at that. And anyway, Ed has a wonderful diary entry where he went to his father's house May 10th, 1982, and his father was angry. Ed writes about this in vivid detail. "My father was angry because the home health nurse was reading Elder McConkie's published version of the account of the revelation, and he left the 'we all heard the same voice' line in there, despite President Kimball asking him to remove it." And anyway, so Ed Kimball is part of the story, and believing Latter-day Saint, and to me, he represents the best in Mormonism in that he can retain his faith, but also cling to the fact that transparency and truth is paramount. And certainly he would never have given me those documents had he not wanted me to work that into the story, because he recognized that it needed to be told.
Thank you. Melissa.
Unmute. Okay, so when my faith broke, one of the best feelings that I got was that I didn't have to excuse the priesthood ban anymore. And but reading this book, well, listening to your interviews and stuff made me rage and embarrassed that I ever belonged to a church that would do these things. It made me insanely upset. I was talking to my believing husband and I said, "Did you know that in order to get the ban lifted, they sent away, they did it because some of the apostles were sent away." And it said, you had said in there that, let's see, they had been prepped for months. They knew it was coming. They knew that, where did you say that? 132. That he had been, it wasn't by accident that Apostle Peterson was away on a church assignment in Ecuador. And then in the notes, it was an interview, Kimball interview with Harris, November 26th, 2013. So I was telling my husband that, I said, no, like that was on purpose. He goes, no, like that's extrapolation. That's an interpretation. Like, how do you know that, like, what is the exact evidence that says, no, this is the exact reason why he was sent away? Or was it just coincidence? And he's like, oh, he's away. This is a great time to lift the ban. Or was he purposely sent there in order to have the ban lifted? And if so, is there specific explicit evidence that that was the case, is my question.
I love questions about evidence because too many people, too many Americans, too many Latter-day Saints, we just sort of spout off our own views all the time as some kind of truth. We don't have a shred of evidence for any of it. So I always tell people, you know, it's always appropriate to ask people, what is your evidence for those sorts of claims, right? And I think that when you see my book and also my podcast, I try to be very, very careful about when I'm just theorizing or speculating as opposed to evidence. And so a couple pieces of evidence to your question. One would be Ed Kimball told me this. And Ed Kimball wasn't just the son of his father who was a confidant. And as a scholar of 20th century Mormonism, I've seen more general authority diaries and letters and meeting minutes than I care to admit. And one of the things that all of the apostles have in common is that they usually have outlets outside of church, the church hierarchy. It's like they have to unburden themselves of, and you can imagine, that's not a negative thing. You can imagine these are ecclesiastical leaders and they're hearing people's problems all the time, right? It's an emotional burden. Some of you in this room may have been former bishops at one point, so you might get a small taste of that. And so they have to unburden themselves, and also not just with the saints and the saints' problems, but also their quarrels with their fellow brethren, right? Some of these guys can't stand each other. And so they have outlets, and usually the outlets are their sons in particular, but also their daughters. They confide in their sons and daughters. Hubie Brown, one of his biggest confidants was his daughter Mary. So I'm writing a biography on Brown now, so I know this. So Ed Kimball was a confidant. His father told him that. and the couple of other pieces of evidence. Spencer Kimball was known to do this. If he couldn't achieve a consensus of the 12 or the top 15, he would send them away, the people who didn't agree with the policy or doctrinal change. He would send them out of the country on some assignment, and then he made sure he had a quorum while they were away. This is not the first time he's done this. So I would say that to your husband. And the last thing I would say is that President Kimball, if you read that chapter carefully on the priesthood ban, he was trying to lift the ban all that spring. He wanted to lift it in March. He didn't have the votes. It was Mark Peterson, Benson, and Stapley who held out. And finally, in May, he wrote out a revelation. This is in May. The ban is still in effect in May. He wrote out a revelation. It's already in his mind. It's already a fait accompli. It's already done. But he has to get the consensus. And so he tried in March. They recognized that he tried in March because he brought it up at the temple meeting during the Thursday temple meetings. He tried again in May unsuccessfully. And then finally, he got Peterson out of the country. Stapley was in the hospital, gravely ill. And then that left one holdout on June 1st. And in my book, I talk about that Elder Benson wanted to table the discussion the minute President Kimball brought it up. Let's not talk about it. And Spencer Kimball, who's a pretty mild-mannered man, he turned to Ezra and he said, no, we're going to do this. This is the day. He had been trying for the previous 3 months. So one of the things that I admire about President Kimball is he was very strategic and very tactical. And he had to do that in order to push this new doctrine forward, because frankly, he wouldn't have been able to do it. Somebody asked me, just real quick, somebody asked me recently if he couldn't have lifted the ban, who would have lifted it? Well, Kimball's successor was Ezra Benson. He wasn't going to lift it. And Benson's successor was Mark Peterson. He sure wasn't going to lift it. And then the next person in line would have been Howard Hunter, which would have been really interesting, or after Benson would have been Howard Hunter. Hunter didn't like the ban either, but he was in poor health during his presidency. He wasn't in the office very long, as we all know. And so I've argued in public, or claimed in public, that the person who would have lifted the ban, who had the independence of mind and frankly the backbone to do it, would have been Gordon Hinckley. And Hinckley would have lifted the ban, but that was Kimball's finest hours. He was able to find a way to do it when his predecessors, including David O. McKay, couldn't.
Thank you. Yvonne, you're next. You're still muted.
I just sent you a request to unmute.
Let's move on while she works. Oh, there you are. Okay, good, Yvonne.
Anyway, so let me just say, Matt, I can second everything that everybody said. I was kind of like Landon. I hardly could put it down. I lived through most of this stuff. I was born in 1954. I attended BYU from 72 to 76, graduated in 1976. And, just a quick observation on and then my husband, Charlie Harrell, got a job in Detroit.
Oh, hi, Yvonne. I recognize you again.
Yeah, no problem. But yeah, so we went right from BYU graduates, both of us, to Detroit, Michigan. Of course, the priesthood ban still being in effect and all that. And it's just amazing to me, that cognitive dissonance, how you can hold two things in your mind, right? You can honor and believe these leaders and everything and love them and want to hear what they say. And also think that you're a very liberal, Christian, not racist person, right? I mean, it's amazing. But I have to say, on your book, very readable, and that also very objective. I think you're very successful as a historian. Hearing you speak, I can tell what your real feelings are. But the book itself, I felt, was very unbiased, objective, scholarly. Yeah. Kudos. Way to go. I have one little thing though, and it's on page 275. And it's So when I attended the temple, I got endowed in 75 and went to the temple all through that era, attended the DC temple and everything. And it's under, I'll just read a little bit. Thomas S. Monson called Martins, this is the part about Helvicchio Martins, when he called him into the governing body in March 1990. At about the same time, the church had changed its temple ceremony, portraying Satan with dark skin. And I never saw that. I never saw Satan portrayed with dark skin. I knew all the Satans well because I went to the temple so much. I mean, not a lot, but I saw the films over and over, very repetitive. And did I miss and I know some of the Satans personally. Daryl Yeager, he was in the two films. He was in our ward here in Orem, the dancer guy. I don't know. And Michael Ballum was the operatic guy. Anyway, so where was the dark-skinned Satan in the temple?
So a quick thought on that, Yvonne. When I was a student at BYU in the early 90s, I used to work for the BYU event staff. It was the greatest job because I used to get paid to watch football and basketball games and crowd control, all that stuff. But I remember one time I was taking tickets at a BYU basketball game, and this tall-looking, blonde-haired man walked in through the portal, and all of these Mormons, I recognized who it was, along with the other Latter-day Saints, and they started whispering, "There's Satan! There's Satan!" And of course, the San Diego State fans are looking at the BYU fans, pointing to this tall, distinguished, blonde-haired man. "There's Satan! There's Satan!" And I can only imagine what the Aztec fans were thinking. People of Provo have lost their minds. So that's a metaphor. The metaphor would be Satan. Yeah, I had to. So it's temple ceremony portraying Satan with dark skin. It didn't say the person had dark skin. It's portraying Satan as evil and dark.
Yeah.
And let me give you a couple of backstory pieces to that. I could have written that better. I totally admit that.
Let me just tell you one thing, because this is and I don't know the name of the original Satan in 1975, but he was more like Lucifer. My roommate, who got married before I did, had to confess, and she said, "I was at the temple. I was having the hots for Satan in the temple." So they were good-looking guys.
Well, I know who it is. So two of the stories I was going to share with you quickly. One is from the time you're talking about, and another one brings us up into the late 80s, about the time that I'm writing about here. But in 1969, the Brethren did want somebody with dark skin to play Satan. And now think about these racial tropes, right? There's a racial binary going on here in Mormon theology, that whiteness is purity, right? And sinlessness, and darkness, be it black or brown, is the sign of some divine curse. And these are very literal. And this is why, the Latter-day Saints, and not just Latter-day Saints, Mormons, but Protestants too, they portray Jesus Christ with this glimmering whiteness. I mean, he's a Middle Eastern Jew, for goodness sakes. He does not have white skin. But yet they've turned him into an Aryan, Caucasian, this muscular, blonde-haired, blue-eyed figure, because it conforms with their racial tropes. Anyway, so in the late 60s, they wanted someone literally with dark skin to play Satan. And that's a problem, because black people can't go to the temple. They can't have a temple recommend. So they found a dark-skinned Polynesian. And when this dark-skinned Polynesian fellow realized why they had selected him because of his dark skin, he was furious. He said, "I'm not going to do this." And so he told Gordon Hinckley, Elder Hinckley, he said, "I'm not doing this. This is racist. I'm out." So they settled on a guy named Spencer Palmer, who taught world religion at BYU for a number of years. I have no idea if that's the person.
Was he kind of handsome?
I knew him when he was older, so yeah.
No, not that.
Yeah, it's hard for me to judge what he looked like, half a century ago. But
I thought my roommate was scandalous. How could she be thinking of that?
She's falling in love with Satan in the temple. That's a book. Anyway, so Spencer Palmer is a very fair-skinned white man. He's the one that tells this story of how he came into the role of Satan. I have the oral history. And so he's the one that told about the dark-skinned Polynesian man. And then the other story I'll share with you, and I don't think she'd mind me sharing this, and so I'll share it. Some of you know Carolyn Pearson, the great LDS poet and artist. she sent me something probably 3 or 4 months ago that was really fascinating. And I wish I had it in time for this book. But she sent me a letter that she wrote to President Hinckley in, I think, 1989, maybe. And the letter was Carolyn, very liberal, inclusive voice. One of the reasons why I love her is she wrote President Hinckley, and accompanying her letter was a picture of a hand, white and black hand. So there's a white hand, a dark hand, black hand. I think it was an African American. And then there's the third hand there. The ends, if you can see my hands, they were like this: black hand, three hands, one black, one white, I think one more brown. Anyway, but it was published in the church news. And the church news had inferred that the black hand was representative of sin and darkness. And she wrote President Hinckley, and she said, I'm going to crudely summarize, but dear President Hinckley, are you serious? Are we still doing this here in the late 20th century? This is embarrassing. And to his credit, he wrote back to her, and she sent me both letters, her letter to him and his to her. He wrote back and he said, oh my gosh, we'll look into this. So he wasn't aware of this. He wasn't condoning it. He wanted to fix it. But the idea is, Yvonne, that even by the late 1980s, they're still depicting darkness with sin. And, it's hard to change old habits when racism is so deeply ingrained in the theology.
It's horrible. And the whole thing was amazing. It's amazing how but I think your book is wonderful. And like I say, I think anybody could read it and say, this guy's not on a rant. He is presenting factual. We have to believe him. So very good.
Yvonne, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Let me say something that was important to me, and I want this group to hear this, and whoever listens on the podcast to hear this, is that I had some of my, I need to leave names out because I work with a lot of people. And let's just say that I had some people very close to the church read the epilogue, because it's so recent. I mean, we've all lived through it, right? And writing about people who are still alive can be a daunting thing. And one of my people who work for the church wrote back and they said, you're really generous with the way you concluded. I can think of a million other reasons why you should have gone in a different direction. And I wrote to my friend back and I said, you're absolutely right, but I wanted to end on a positive note because I wanted the brethren to see it doesn't have to be this way, that you can move forward. I think people are forgiving, that you can apologize for this racist garbage and you can move the church forward. But so I chose to focus on mostly the positive. I didn't skirt anything for sure, right? Talking about the stuff at BYU that's still ongoing, the racism there and all of that. But I did want to end on a positive note because I wanted church leaders who have read this book, by the way, at least 2 apostles in the Quorum of the 12 have read this book that I know of. And I want them to see that, there is a different choice that leaders can make moving forward.
And your book's making a tremendous difference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Martine.
Myself, yeah. Is that okay?
Yep.
All right. Hi, Matt.
Hi.
I am severely ADHD, so I can pretty much guarantee I won't read the book. But I have, I'm making my way through. I did buy it, however, and I loaned it out. So, but I'm making my way through your Mormon Stories episodes. And in one of them, you mention Apostle John Henry Smith, who was the father of George Albert Smith. And you mentioned that John Henry, who is my husband's great-grandfather, incidentally, was not, I can't remember your exact words, but he was not exactly on board with the ban. Can you elaborate on that? And is there a source you can send us to read more? Because I understand it's not in the book.
Oh, boy, let me reconstruct my thought on that. John Henry Smith, I don't recall saying that. I did say that John Widsoe was not on board with the ban.
And John Henry Smith, you mentioned both.
Did I mention John Henry Smith?
Yeah.
Wait, I don't remember that. Let's see. Well, let me say one thing that I have written about regarding John Henry Smith. I don't remember him saying that he was opposed to the ban. I talked about George Albert Smith.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, but John Henry Smith, there was an African American Latter-day Saint who moved to Utah in the early 20th century. He was a terrific athlete, and he was this all-state running back at East High School. I mean, he was really an incredible athlete. He got a full scholarship to the University of Michigan later on. Anyway, he converted to Mormonism along with his family. And of course, this is the early 20th century. The racism is just through the roof, as you can imagine, much as it is nationally. And when John Henry Smith noticed this little African American child sobbing at the street corner, he went over to him and he said, "Why are you crying?" And the boy said that the kids in my deacon's quorum told me that because I'm a Negro, I'm going to hell. And he was just sobbing. And John Henry Smith, the apostle, invited him into his house. Apparently, John Henry was walking home. Invited him into his house, and pulled out the Book of Mormon, read 2 Nephi 26:33, that all are likened to God. And basically, you're favored in God's eyes. Never mind what those boys are saying. And I don't know, Martine, if he opposed the ban, but he certainly was sensitive to anti-Black racism. And for someone to have that sensitivity in the early 20th century, I think is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I don't believe you said he opposed it, but you intimated that he was not comfortable with it.
That's probably possible, because I don't have any direct evidence that he opposed it.
Right.
The only person that I know of who opposes the ban, I mean, I write about him. The apostles that I know of who oppose it would be Adam Benyon, John Widtsoe, and then of course Hugh Brown. Just he loses everything over his opposition to it.
Right.
But most of the apostles, in varying degrees, support the ban.
Okay. May I ask one? Well, I'd like to add something. So his son was George Albert Smith. And my husband and I really appreciate the work you've done in mostly rehabilitating his name in terms of, I met you at your benchmark presentation, and we talked about that a little bit. Both Reuben Clark and David O. McKay obviously had college degrees. They had college education. So our feeling has been, for as long as we've known about the infamous George Albert Smith presidency statement and the correspondence with Lowry Nelson, that when that letter came in, considering George Albert's poor health throughout his life, and the fact that he was not scholarly like his two counselors, he likely walked over to J. Reuben Clark's office and said, we got this letter and I don't know how to respond to that. Well, you've got the background, you can write better than I do. You write something and we'll all sign it. That's been.
Yeah, I think you'll see a lot of instances in church history, especially modern church history, where the first presidency will issue a statement, but it doesn't always reflect what they believe personally. Instead, it reflects the need for a unified voice to the saints, that we're behind this. But when the first presidency produced that statement in 1949, codifying the church's race doctrine, the whole curse and pre-existent stuff, David O. McKay does not believe this stuff, but he signed it.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't believe that Black people are cursed, but he signed that. He doesn't believe that it's a direct revelation from God, but he signed it. And when I was in the George Albert Smith Jr. papers at Harvard, so his son taught at Harvard Business School for years, and I was back one day doing something at Harvard. I can't even remember what it was, and I realized that George Albert Smith's son had taught there, and I thought, I wonder if he donated his papers to the archives there, and he did. So that was my goofy, nerdy afternoon, kid in the candy shop, going through his papers. And George Albert Smith Jr. said that my dad thought it was a policy and it was never doctrinal, even though he signed that 49 statement.
Mhm.
And so there are lots of gradations and nuances when you start to see their private papers. They don't always mesh with what you see that's released publicly. And especially with David O. McKay, I mean, it's pretty clear he does not support the ban at some point in his life. And he doesn't lift it for the reasons I talk about. He doesn't have the capital, the Joseph Fielding Smith and the hardliners won't allow him to do it. But if he had his way, he would have lifted the ban 20 plus years before Spencer Kimball did. But anyway, but George Albert Smith, like you said, was too ill. He had a nerve condition, for your readers who may not know this, and he was frequently incapacitated. And so, frankly, Reuben Clark and David O. McKay were running the church during most of his presidency. And he wasn't signing any of that, right? The brethren don't sign letters. They have a stamp. They have their secretaries are the ones that stamp all of this. And so I can't prove this, but it's likely that George Albert Smith didn't even read that statement that Reuben Clark wrote, and they just stamped it.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that his name's on it, but that's not the person he was. So that's...
Yeah, good to hear. Glad to hear that. It's always good to hear a different perspective.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
All right, Mark, you're up.
Yes. Well, Matt, you have two Belgians in a row, but I still live in Belgium. Now, I have these two books of yours. And when I heard that your book was coming out, I pre-ordered it, but it takes a while to get in Belgium. So I bought the Kindle version first. And when I had finished the Kindle version, then the book arrived. Now, I have a question about, you've talked to a lot of people, and I wonder if they realize what the curse of Cain is. Because when I read Genesis 4, the curse of Cain is that he would not be able to till the ground and he would become a fugitive. And he was afraid of being killed. So the Lord placed a mark upon him. It doesn't say what the mark is, but actually the mark was a divine protection, so he would not be killed. But the curse is the fact that he could not till the ground. And I've always been indoctrinated that the curse is the black skin. But the scriptures show otherwise. So I wonder if, any of the people you talk to realize that.
No. So Latter-day Saints, the best way to, so you're asking a theological question, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of theology in my book. You can't certainly write a book about race and not talk about the theology that anchored these beliefs. But as a historian, that's how I see the world. And if you want to understand early Mormon theology, you have to look at who the earliest converts are shaping and creating the theology. And there's been a lot written about this, so I'm not unique in what I'm about to say, which is that a lot of the early Mormon converts in the 1830s and 40s come from Protestant backgrounds. So it's not surprising that they bring these traditional views of the curse of Cain with them that derives from the broader Protestant world. Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, they all, or at least a number of them, interpret this curse of Cain to be something, demonic, if you will. And there's no question, Mark, that people who are trained in biblical languages and literature, they've pushed back on that over the years. Like, you guys are nuts. You don't know what you're talking about. You need to historicize these verses and understand the particular language and the clauses and phrases. But, in my experience, ministers, and they don't really care about the context. They usually create a theology that's serviceable to their needs. And so the Latter-day Saints had inherited this curse stuff, lock, stock, and barrel from the broader Protestant world from which they came. And then, as I argue in my book, what sets Latter-day Saints apart in their religious beliefs vis-a-vis the race issue? It's not the curse of Cain stuff or Ham. It's this idea that Black people were neutral or less valiant in the pre-earth life. That is wholly uniquely Mormon. And so they wed that belief with the curse of Cain belief. And it's those two beliefs that remain vibrant through the 20th century. But you can, Mark, if we were to parse, how Latter-day Saint leaders have taken things out of context and created new meanings that aren't there, I mean, we'd be here up until the next 8 months,
Yes.
right?
But, you would expect that living prophets would have better insight into the scriptures than that. And actually, I don't know if you realize that, but I have the King James Version. It's a 2017 edition. And if you look at the mark of Cain and you go to the footnotes, it goes to Moses 7:22, where it says that the sons of Cain were black. But like I said, that's not the mark. But it's still in the scriptures. And I think they should change that. But of course, that's my opinion.
But once again, keep in mind, Joseph Smith comes from a broader Protestant background. And he's the one producing the Book of Moses, right?
Yeah, he produces it. There you say it.
Yeah. So, it reflects the broader 19th century world from which he comes. I don't know how else to say it. So it doesn't surprise me. Let me say one thing to the audience that I think I hope is instructive. And that is that we probably all had experiences where the brethren are asked about certain biblical passages, from the Old Testament or something like this. I remember on my mission, I was having dinner and we were talking about our day, and this good Latter-day Saint family was feeding us, my companion and I. And this man, he said, I'm teaching gospel doctrine on Sunday, and I had a question about this Old Testament verse. And so I wrote Elder Ashton, Marvin J. Ashton. I wrote Elder Ashton a note asking him, what does this mean? And I remember as a missionary thinking, I think this guy sold used cars or something before he was called into the ministry. What does he know about the Old Testament? And the idea would be, of course, that his ecclesiastical position somehow gave him some special knowledge about biblical languages and culture, which is just clearly not the case, right? And one of the things that I've learned reading about the Brethren's private papers is they recognize they're not scholars, and they reach out to scholars for validation of some things they write about the scriptures. For example, Reuben Clark, who was not a person to feel like he needed to be, asking for permission from other members. He was a lawyer by profession, very bright man, but he wasn't trained in biblical languages or literature. And when he wrote a book in 1954 called Why the King James Version, think about this. He's a lawyer and he's writing a book about the Bible, or a translation of the Bible. And when I went through his papers, I was struck by, he was reaching out to LDS biblical scholars. And he was asking them, what do you think? Am I on good ground here? Give me a good critique. And one of the guys that critiqued him was a guy named Sidney Sperry, who had a PhD in Old Testament languages and literature from Chicago and taught at BYU. Sperry wrote him back and marked the hell out of the book. Really critiqued it. And I thought, good for Clark for recognizing his limitations, but not all leaders are that way.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Mandy, you're up. Are you there, Mandy? We can come back to you. Dave, do you want to go?
Sure. Hi, Matt.
Hi.
Hey, towards the end of your book, you reference the infamous Strengthening the Brethren Committee. I think I have the name correct on that. And it's understandable that you didn't talk a lot about it because it wasn't really the main point of what you were trying to share. But you did, I think, spend at least a paragraph on it. And so I have two questions. Number one, are you able to share, just from all of your extensive research for your amazing book, any more insights about this committee that you feel like you could share? And then my second question is, as a result of your activities, maybe including this book, have you been made aware that you have become the subject of inquiry for this committee?
I hope so, Dave. It would be a badge of honor. I mean, frankly, I don't pay attention to things like this. If I'm on I'm certain I'm on it. It wouldn't surprise me at all. But I don't, I don't consider myself somebody who's out to stick my finger in anybody's eyeball. I think those of you who have heard me speak and write my book, I try to be sensitive. I try to be balanced. I'm not incendiary, but I try to be truthful. And if the truth lands me on that watch list, I can I can look at myself in the mirror and do all right. I do know who's on it. I have a list that's probably somebody sent this to me. I can't reveal names. I want to be very, very careful to guard confidences. But about last year, I think, 12 months ago, somebody sent me a 25 or 30-page document with all the names on there. And at least as it pertained to, well, I don't want to say more, but I have a 30-page list. This would have been in the late 80s, early 90s, about the time that I'm writing about. And there were a number of intellectuals on there. And some people that I'll name a few because it's not a surprise, but Eugene England was on there, right? I write about him. He's very liberal. He was certainly on there. Um, let's see. I need to reread the list, but I remember England was on there. There's some people that I didn't think should have been on there, but they were. And I know that Elder Holland was asked about that list by a journalist recently, a couple of years ago. Some of you are probably more up on that than I am, but they asked him about the list, and then he came clean and said that, that there was a list. But, I don't know. It's hard I have to say, I'm saddened by what's going on right now at BYU, that there's a retrenchment going on. A lot of these folks are my friends. They're good people. They're good Latter-day Saints. And I'm looking at on some conservative LDS venues online. They're attacking Peggy Fletcher Stack, who's an exceptional journalist. And she's a hack. She's this. They're attacking her good name, which she's used to it. That's what journalists get attacked all the time. Their work, but the thing is that the people that I know. And I know a lot of people at BYU who still work there. I think they're the finest the church has to offer. They're believing Latter-day Saints, so the day is long. And they obviously don't always accept some of the views, lock, stock, and barrel, like they're told to. But let me give you one example that some of these good faculty are struggling with. If you get a kid who is gay or trans at BYU, that's not a safe place for them, right? It's not a safe space for people like students like that. So what they do is they identify faculty that are flowing with empathy and love and inclusion. They identify who those faculty are. They go into their office and they just unburden themselves. I'll give you one example. One student went to the religion class and they were talking about that gender is timeless, and they were talking about the proclamation of the family. And of course, this trans student's just like flummoxed. I mean, it's just having this massive crisis. And they went to one of their confidants on the faculty explaining their grief. And the faculty was listening and trying to reassure them and give them the love they needed in that hour. And now the faculty are told that you can't even be receptive to students like that. You can't wear a rainbow pin. You can't go to a rainbow pride. You can't do anything. And all of these, all the faculty are trying to do is just to be a Christian, just to take these kids in their time of need. And they're being told that they can't be gracious like that. And that's not what's being reported by the critics to Peggy's story. And that's heartbreaking to me because I know a lot of these people, and once again, I think they're the best that the church has to offer, and they're being kicked to the curb. It's just tragic.
Thank you, Matt.
Mandy, are you there yet?
Yes, I am here. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Thanks.
Awesome. Great. Matt, thank you so much for this book. I just love it. I've listened to all of your interviews, and you kept saying that, how dare you write, 1,000-page book or whatever, because, all the stuff that you had to edit out. But what if you were to release the editor's cut, like the director's cut of the long version of the movie? I think people would really be receptive to that because of all the stories that you tell during your interviews that are not in the book. They're fantastic.
No, thank you.
And that's my question was, would you be willing to put out a longer version?
Well, I'd have to think about it. I don't have copyright control, so I think that's an easy one to dispense with. That Oxford would never give me permission to do it, at least right now. Because if I put out an uncut edition, they wouldn't let me. It's a legal thing. I just couldn't do it. But even if I did do it, it would cut into their cells. And the only way that I could ever possibly release the uncut version would be years down the road when they would give me permission, when they wouldn't deem it in direct conflict with the book that they published.
Sure. And I understand that. So maybe a few
Yeah.
years down the road, we can look for it.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, but this is still a hot topic. I mean, this book is selling incredible, and the audio version is supposed to come out next month. And there are a lot of people who, for whatever reason, don't want to read the small print, or they just like to listen to audio, that they're waiting for the audio to come out. And so it would be at least 3 or 4 years, I would think, if they would allow me to do it. But let me say something about what I cut out, or at least some of the things I cut out. Some of the things I didn't want to cut out, but I wanted to keep the book reasonably priced. I mean, I know that $39 is what it retails for, and that's like, oh my goodness. I mean, that's the world we live in today, where books cost nearly $40. But I didn't want it to be more than that. And so I had to be really careful. My footnotes were twice as long, if you can imagine that. And so I have an abbreviations page in the book. You see all those little abbreviations where it says SWK after the footnote. That's the Spencer Kimball papers. Then you have to go to the abbreviation to see where those are located. I had to do all of that to shrink, because I had to come in under a certain word count to keep the price point where it was. And I could have produced the longer book if I wanted, I think. I could have won that fight, but it would have been more expensive. And I wanted to make this book as cheaply as possible. And that's the compromise we had to come up with.
Well, I look forward to a few years down the road when I can get all of the meat.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You bet.
All right, Summer, you're up.
Hey, Matt.
Hey,
Thank you so much
Summer.
for doing this. Matt's my buddy, and I'm just so grateful I have questions to even ask, because I kind of follow him everywhere and I listen to all the interviews and
Thanks,
all that.
Summer. I'm giving you a hug.
And this book, it's been amazing. And for those of you who don't know, I have done a lot of interviews with Matt, and it's, what somebody was saying earlier about cognitive dissonance, and how as members we somehow are able to hear all these things and believe all these things, but at the same time know in our hearts that it's wrong. The racism is wrong and the misogyny is wrong. But as a member of the church, a Black member of the church especially, I have seen so many of my friends dealing with an internalized hatred for themselves, for their color, and not knowing why. And this book it's become an inner voice for a lot of people within the Black community who are saying, why is it that I feel this way? Why is it that I've been treated this way? And not really understanding why, but knowing that it's not in their mind. It's not, they're not crazy, that there were some policies, but also some underlying things that were said to make them feel that way without realizing why they felt that way. So I just want to start my question with just saying thank you again so much, Matt. Every time I talk to you, I say thank you. But just thank you so much for taking the time and being such a big ally for those that just, are struggling and don't know why. This is a good, start as to why there's a struggle. So just thank you for that. So I had two questions, and I kind of feel like you're a little bit of a Nostradamus, because one of the questions was the BYU new article. I wanted to know, as a historian, and kind of in this book, you talk about how there's a time where the church is very open to scholars and open to education, and people from all over the world kind of thinking of different things and talking about different things on campus. And then there comes a point where leadership kind of says, no, we can't do that anymore. And they kind of buckle down on the censorship and things like that. So my first question was, do you see history kind of repeating itself from what you've read and written about in the past of what BYU has done, but also, church leadership has done in the past? Do you kind of see that repeating itself with Peggy's recent article? And the other question I had was, as a historian, and you have been doing this for decades of just kind of the civil rights and things like that within the church, what was the most shocking for you, reading about, learning about, whether it was in the things that Ed Kimball gave you, or different diary entries or things that you heard from other people? What was one of the most shocking things that you learned in writing this book that you didn't know before?
So the first question is, how do I look at BYU, Summer? Is that fair?
Do you see history kind of repeating itself in a way?
Yeah, I do. In the sense that at BYU, I know BYU really well. That's not because it's my alma mater. It's because I've gone through so many institutional papers there over the years. And that's another collection, by the way, that I got access to see that I wouldn't get access to see today. The presidential papers of Ernest Wilkinson and other collections that are institutional. BYU's clamped down on all of that in the last couple of years. Again, not because of my book. They did it before my book came out. I can't take credit. But anyway, so they've always been really, really sensitive to faculty who put their secular views first. And that's always been an issue, as you can imagine, right? Take science, for example. If you have a PhD in biology and you're teaching about organic evolution, Joseph Fielding Smith and Bruce McConkie want you to teach their views, not what you learned in your graduate program. And some of these Latter-day Saint biologists, they're saying, that's crazy. You guys, you're not trained in science. You don't know what you're talking about. You're just reading a bunch of fundamentalist nonsense, and you want us to spew it, teach it to our students. Not going to do that. A, it's wrong. And B, we're not going to prepare our students for medical school by giving them this fundamentalist young earth creation theory, baloney. So they've always been after people like that. And what you see is so it started with Wilkinson in particular. BYU used to be very open with evolution and other things. Wilkinson starts to clamp down in the 50s and 60s. And then you see a period of openness at BYU under Dallin Oaks, I know that might be hard to hear today because he seems to be sort of moved further to the right in his beliefs and teachings. But in the 70s at BYU, he was very open, and the faculty generally enjoyed him. And in fact, he was so open that he got fired. They fired him in 1980. A little secret there. They fired him in 1980 because he didn't want to hire some right-wing extremists on the BYU political science faculty. And they pushed him out. So anyway, and of course the question is, how did he get ordained to the Council of the 12 if they pushed him out? And the answer is Spencer Kimball did it. Ezra Taft Benson, with whom Oaks had clashed, never would have called Oaks into the 12 if it was his call to make. So you see different periods like that, Summer, and what we're seeing now is arguably the worst of it, because they're creating another whole level. The BYU administrators are creating another whole level of paperwork that faculty have to follow in order to keep their employment. Holding a temple recommend is not enough. They have to, I'm going to be hyperbolic here, but they have to, take a knife out and carve in their office door that they're anti-LGBTQ. It's terrible what they're making them do, but that's what it is. They've been too cozy with their LGBTQ students in terms of their concerns and their liberal views. And so we're seeing that now. It's usually driven by personalities in the leadership. Clark Gilbert is the commissioner of education. He's a member, I think, of the First Quorum of the 70s, so he's a general authority. He's the one that's getting all the bad rap for the clampdown. But the truth is, I've always told people, they take their orders from the Board of Trustees. He's just the guy in between. He's the buffer. So it's not like he woke up one day and went to the board and we got to clamp down on these guys. He's just doing what he's told to do. In fact, you can make an argument he was hired to do this. So there's that. The second part of your question is
what was the most shocking?
Well, the most shocking. Okay, the most shocking. That's a hard one. I've been around this for a long time. I've been, so it's hard to shock me. I mean, some people aren't you shocked? I'm like, well, my expectations are pretty low. So no, I'm pleasantly surprised. What shocked me the most, Summer, I think, two things shocked me. One is in the 1920s and 30s. I shouldn't be shocked by this, but when I saw the church's publications, the Improvement Era, the Millennial Star, all the magazines that the church published in the 1920s and 30s, and the stuff they put in there. I mean, I can't expect the church to not be racist, right? I mean, they're living in such a disgustingly racist culture. But for the church to just, and I wrote about some of this in my book, right? They're just peddling this crap, lock, stock, and barrel about Black people. They're making fun of Black people. They had a little place in the LDS magazines. It's called the Humor's Corner, something like that. There's like a little corner, a little paragraph, and they would tell these terribly racist jokes. And they would use the N-word in general conference. So that kind of shocked me, And then the second thing that shocked me is in the 1960s, when I saw the Ernest Wilkinson presidential papers, which is under lock and key today. So I'm fortunate that I got access. The president of BYU had to give me access to it, a guy named Cecil Samuelson at the time. And I made the request and I said, I'm just doing BYU and civil rights. And of course, I don't know what's in the collection. I just want to see it. And so President Samuelson gave me permission based on the recommendation of the archivist. And when I got into the collection, I thought, damn, they have no idea what they just gave me permission to see. Now, that would never happen today because they have lawyers that go through each document today. You would never, it just wouldn't happen. But years ago when I made the request, I remember having this like moment of nirvana, I'm in the corner of the BYU reading room in the basement of the library. And, my head's tingling because I'm reading all this confidential stuff that they gave me access to see. And in one of the documents I saw in there was Ernest Wilkinson wrote this 37-page memo that I cite in my book. It's called Ultra Confidential. And don't think that didn't perk my antennas up. And, so I'm reading this 37-page memo, and I was shocked, Summer, to see Wilkinson admit to the brethren, we've been lying to federal authorities. We've been saying that we follow the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but we don't. And I can't keep doing this, meaning I can't keep lying. I can't do this anymore. They're on to us. And we have to admit Black students. We have to recruit them. We have to give them scholarships and aid. That's what they call them in those days. Today, we just call them scholarships. We have to give them scholarships and aid just like we do white students. We've been telling them we do, but we don't. I mean, it was the most revealing, damning document I've seen. And weirdly enough, in some strange way, because I think Wilkinson is not one of Mormonism's finest characters. He's a complete bigot. But at one point, reading some of this stuff, I actually had a modicum of sympathy for the guy because he was hung out to dry by the federal authorities. I mean, they're after him, right? But yet he takes his cues from the board, and the board, they don't know what to do. They don't want to admit Black students, but yet Wilkinson knows that they're not going to win this fight. And he's trying to make this legalistic First Amendment argument that we have a right to the First Amendment's freedom of religious clause. In other words, we could take whatever students we want. And at that point, the Department of Justice under Lyndon Johnson and then Richard Nixon, they were clamping down on all of that. And if the Civil Rights Act clashes with your religious freedom, the Civil Rights Act's going to win every time. Thank goodness. And that's what did it in. And so that kind of shocked me when he was caught in the meat grinder, because you really see how these doctrines and policies affect real life people. And when you read their documents, their diaries, and their meeting minutes, I mean, these aren't just abstract ideas. They affect people, including the general authorities who are asked to implement these doctrines. They have responses to it all in varying degrees.
Thanks so much, Matt.
Thank
Thank you again.
You bet. Good to see you, Summer.
Thank you. Along that similar line, you talked about a story of where the Q15 members show up to BYU to kind of set the doctrine straight, and that's where you have that Marky Peterson notorious talk there. And there was a question asked, I've got this person who looks very white, blue eyes, blonde hair, who's got questionable background, maybe some of this cursed blood. What should I do with him? What kind of counsel should I give him on marriage? And Joseph Fielding Smith is like, we don't want to give you any counsel. I don't want to touch that one. I'm like, you coward, you created this doctrine. This is your mess. You need to clean it up. Give me some advice. And they won't even touch it. And so it affects real people's lives, and they refuse to take accountability for it. And that was extremely frustrating when I was reading that.
I had an experience. I can relate to that. There's a part in the book where I talk about Joseph Fielding Smith at a priesthood meeting, and there was this kid from, oh goodness, was it Sweden? I can't remember. This white kid from Sweden, I think, or Norway. Anyway, he had migrated to the United States with his family, and it turns out that he was going to marry a woman in the temple, and then he discovered doing his genealogy that he had a cursed ancestry. And T. Edgar Lyon, who taught at the Institute, the University of Utah, for a number of years, he was the mission president. It was in Holland. He was a mission president in Holland, so he got to know the boy and his family. Anyway, when the boy found out after they had moved to the United States that he had a cursed ancestry, he went to President Lyon. He said, "What do I do?" And then Lyon went to the priesthood meeting and asked Joseph Fielding Smith. And at first, before the meeting started, Smith told Lyon, he said, "Tell the boy it's pretty obvious what our doctrine is. He can't get married in the temple." And the boy his older brother was a stake president. The other one was on a high council. So it was going to have a ripple effect on all of the brothers serving faithful, church service. After the meeting was over, Smith called Lyon back up and he said, "I had a change of heart. Don't tell anybody about this. Don't have the boy tell his bishop. Don't tell anybody." And in other words, I know that you have a cursed lineage, but hey, get married in the temple anyway, because it will affect too many people. And when I turned the manuscript into my editor, who's very shrewd, he wrote in big letters, "Plot twist," this this real hardliner kind of guy, Joseph Fielding Smith. And he's basically turning a blind eye. And he wanted me to talk more about this. And I wish that I could have, but I just didn't have I said what I knew in what I said. I wish I could have expounded upon this so-called plot twist, but I didn't have the boy's private papers. I don't even know his name. I just know T. Edgar Lyon writes about all of this. So, plot twist.
Yeah. Cameron, you're up.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Harris. This has been a pleasure. I wanted to let you know that your book on Second Class Saints I've read quite a few books under the Mormon Studies umbrella, and it's my favorite book. I think the way you wrote it, I echo all the compliments that have been given so far, but one other thing I would add to that is it is so accessible and it's so easy to read. It reads like a novel. And I have a bunch of books published by Oxford. It's so accessible. You broaden the category of people that can access this information, and it's so compelling. So just thank you. It's just an amazing book. I did want to make one note, and then I'll ask you my question, because on this BYU topic, I have a transgender kid. I've been a BYU fan all my life, and I'm a season ticket holder of football. And a few years ago, I was really struggling with, hey, can I still be a fan? And so I started creating rainbow t-shirts and stuff to bring to the games and to wear to the games so that I can show my support for the LGBTQ community. And so that's how I go to games now, and I get a lot of compliments from people, and people will talk to me from time to time. Anyway, I talked to a young lady just a couple months ago at one of the games. She's a lesbian. She had just transferred from the U of U down to BYU, and I asked her what her experience was like, and we had a really great conversation. And even in spite of all the retrenchment, she said that she's feeling very accepted. She's found a good group of friends. She said, I think she was in the liberal arts college, and she's found professors or even teachers that are affirming and safe for her to talk to. And so, in spite of all Clark Gilbert's trying to do, I think there are good people there that are still trying to make a good effort, and it's helping. I mean, 15 to 20% of the kids there are LGBTQ. That's just the reality. All this retrenchment that they're doing, they can't make that go away. So, anyway, they need our support.
I love that, Cameron. Thank you.
Yeah. So here's my question. So before reading your book, I've always given a lot of credit to Lester Bush's dialogue article as being potentially one of the biggest catalysts for the change. Now, there's a lot of things going on that your book elucidates that I didn't know about before, and the history of how many years it took for that change to happen, and Brazil and the Genesis group, and all the stuff that happened to create the change that finally happened in 78. Could you illuminate what you think is maybe the one or two most critical things that helped that change to go into place? Because I don't think the Bush article is quite as important in my mind as I used to think it was after reading your book.
So the question is the changes that I think that led to the lifting of the ban?
Yeah. Like what maybe was the most important thing in your mind? I know there's a lot of things that contributed, but yeah.
I think, yeah. So there's, as historians, we don't like to pin, our variables to one variable, but we can rank order causation, right? And for me, reading Spencer Kimball's unredacted journals, it was clear he was having an emotional response to the racism, the anti-Black theology. And I was shocked when I was in Orem, Utah at Moon's, let's see, is it called Moon's Used Books? Anyway,
Rare Books. Yeah, Moon's Rare Books.
Moon's Rare Books, thank you. So I was at Moon's Rare Books, and Reed Moon, the owner, came over to me one day, and I wasn't there spontaneously. He invited me, so he wanted to show me some things. So anyway, he brought out some scriptures that you're going to want to see these. I'm like, okay. So he brings out the standard works from 1954, and I'm thinking, okay, big deal. And then I realized they're Spencer W. Kimball's scriptures that he somehow purchased at wherever he got them. And the reason why he wanted me to see them is because he had gone through them himself, and Spencer Kimball made several notations in the margins about the racist scriptures, the verses. For example, somebody asked a minute ago about Moses, skins of blackness, and all of that. And Spencer Kimball circles this, and he draws a line into the margins, and he puts Negro question mark. He doesn't believe this stuff. He's questioning this stuff in 1954, the traditional doctrinal rationalizations. And so you can start to see these seeds percolating in his mind, the way that he's having this conversation textually with his scriptures, which I found fascinating. And I mentioned this in my book. And then also in 1963, he writes a letter to his son, Ed. Ed was in Wisconsin at the time as a professor of law. And Spencer Kimball, who's an apostle at the time, tells his son, Ed, that the ban may, quote, have been a possible error. And then by 1969, he sides with Hugh B. Brown and agrees that the ban ought to be lifted. So you get to see all all of that. And Spencer Kimball recognizes that the church will never be able to fulfill its purpose as long as you have this cloud hanging over the church with this ban. Everywhere they went from the 60s forward, the first thing that the news media asked the brethren, whether it was a temple dedication, whether it was some public event, when are you going to lift the ban? And they're sick and tired of being asked this. And so when he's the president, he knows he has to lift the ban. He has this great vision to globalize the church. So that is the biggest thing driving this, is that he knows that the ban needs to be lifted for the image of the church. And he knows it's the right thing to do because he's been around and counseled Black and biracial Latter-day Saints. He's seen how this ban has harmed them personally, or they didn't want to be in their black skin, as Summer Rain mentioned a minute ago. I mean, he saw the psychological damage. And to me, that was the human emotion that I needed to see from his diaries. And, critics have said it was the IRS putting pressure. Oh, bullshit. The IRS, I mean, if the evidence was there, I would have written that. But the truth is, he wanted to lift the ban the minute he became the president. So you can't argue it was the IRS pressuring Kimball in 78 to do it when he already made up his mind to do it years earlier. So anyway, it was that moment that he needed to globalize the church, and the ban was incompatible with that. I'll say one last thing, is that the brethren, they knew, because they talk about this in their core meetings all the time, they knew they can't determine who's got cursed blood. They know that they are unwittingly baptizing people with African ancestry in Brazil and South Africa. They know this is happening all the time. And the truth is, they turned a blind eye to it in some instances. And depending on who the priesthood leader is, they revoke their priesthood and make them stay their hand. I mean, it's a comedy of errors. It's an embarrassment. So you get all of this coming to bear with President Kimball's ministry. And to me, that's the genius of his leadership, is that he's able to get the church leaders to come on board to lift the ban, to move the church forward. And some of his predecessors wouldn't even consider it, like Harold Lee and others. They just wouldn't even talk about it. But Kimball was able to do what they couldn't do. I get a little emotional about this.
Yeah. Thank you. Greg, you're next.
Yeah, we've got about probably 10 minutes or so, and want to get everybody who had a question in. So if we can,
I think part of my question has been answered. My great grandmother was born a slave, and through some property transfers, she ended up with her husband in the 1860s after the Civil War. She had 10 children, including my great grandmother, and turns out that they were all endowed once they got to Salt Lake. And my question is, did the brethren know that far back that the ban was so porous and ridiculous? I know they sent people to South America or South Africa to do genealogy to make sure that nobody with a drop of blood was baptized. But obviously it was happening. My great grandmother was born to two black people. She passed as white and went to the temple at about 1911, I believe is when it was. So did they have an idea back then that it was like that? So far, you mentioned some cases, but what did they know and when did they know it?
Yeah, Greg, no question they knew, especially because they talk about they went into South Africa in 1904 for the first time. They tried to get in there earlier in 1854, and they were worried about baptizing people with cursed ancestry. And they went into Brazil in 1928. They went into the northern part of Brazil, or the southern part of Brazil, where German people mostly resided. And they just sort of speculated that their ethnic ancestry was known, so we can just baptize and confer priesthood ordination on them. But don't go into the northern part of the country, because that's predominantly black. We want to stay away from that. But what happened was people in the northern part of the country started to migrate to the southern part of the country. And it made it more difficult for missionaries to sift out black Brazilians from white Brazilians. So they knew they were doing this. And in fact, they knew they were baptizing and conferring ordination on people of mixed race lineage. And so even in 1940, Apostle Peterson returned from Brazil, and Elder Peterson made a recommendation to close all the missions in Brazil because they were baptizing and conferring. So there's that. And the other thing is that I'll share is that it's sometimes people have asked me about Elijah Abel's son and grandson. And so Elijah Abel, for the people today, just a refresher, he was one of the first priesthood holders, and he was a light-skinned African-American man. And he was in the good graces of the church. He was ordained the priesthood under Joseph Smith's tutelage or during his tenure as church president. And his son and grandson were ordained to the priesthood. And somebody once said to me that the bishop in Logan, Utah, who did these ordinances went rogue. I'm like, you're not a Mormon bishop and you go rogue and live to tell about it. That's nonsense. So what had happened was they're light-skinned. They were passing below the color line. They were passing as white. They wanted upward mobility and privilege in the church. And what a better way to do it than just to say you're white when you know your ancestry. And a lot of Latter-day Saints are following national trends in doing this. This is going on in the United States at large. When if you're light-skinned biracial, you don't want to say that you're black, because that means you go to the poor neighborhood or the poor school or the racism and all of that. So you pass as white so that you could have the privileges that white people have. And it was going on in the LDS church. They were leaving Brazil, they were leaving particularly South Africa, and they were going to Utah, and where they looked white, and their bishop would never ask them about their ancestry. So they would go in, they would pass the interview worthiness tests, and then they would, in some cases, go on missions and get married in the temple. And then, of course, the parents back in South Africa are disturbed by this, right? Because they have the same DNA. And they're saying that, wait a minute, my son just got married in the temple. Why can't my wife and I get sealed? Well, it was just a function of geography. It was a function of what questions to ask in South Africa and what questions not to ask in Salt Lake City. So they knew this all the time. And Greg, they talk about it in their meeting minutes all the time and in their letters. So this is not an open or a closed thing.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, Peter.
Hi, Professor. Thanks for taking my question. In looking at the church's gospel topics essay on race and the priesthood, it concludes with this platitude about that God is, quote, no respecter of persons. And then it quotes from a verse in 2nd Nephi, quote, that the Lord denieth none that cometh unto him, black and white, bond and free, male and female, all are alike unto God, both Jew and Gentile. My question is really two-part is, why do you think African Americans succeeded where women, LDS women, have not in obtaining priesthood? And two, do you think the cultural conditions exist that would permit women going forward to achieve the same level of equality that African American men have in the church?
Yeah. So I take a very pragmatic approach to questions like this about change and also LGBTQ issues and change. It's always driven by leadership. This is a leadership-driven church. And, the church looks differently depending on who the leader is, right? If Dieter Uchtdorf is the church president one day, one can imagine that the church is going to look a whole lot different than, say, David Bednar. And so with changes like this, the brethren, in my experience, the brethren listen when there are numbers. If there's just a few people, when I say a few, I mean not a critical mass, let's say, but if there's a few people in the corner who are saying, hey, let's do this or that, it's easy to ignore them. But when you start getting a groundswell of people, like you saw with the ban, I mean, they were getting hammered on the ban every direction. They were getting it externally from people outside of the church, and they were getting it internally. And it's not like the internal folks, the Latter-day Saint folks, were these big liberals. I mean, just average, even conservative Latter-day Saints were like, this isn't right. I mean, imagine explaining to your neighbor, why is it that black people in your church can't hold the priesthood? Well, they were less valiant. They were neutral in this pre-earth life. I mean, that's ridiculous. So it's bad theology too, right? Because Mormonism suggests that if you sin, that you should be able to repent of those sins. And if you teach that the atonement's infinite means infinite. Doesn't mean there are exceptions. So it's just bad theology. And some Latter-day Saints even pointed that out to them. With the women in the priesthood, there's just not a critical mass. If there's a critical mass of people, like there was with the ban, you would see the brethren start to talk about it. And that's how the revelatory process takes place in Mormonism, is it starts with questions. Should we be talking about the rightness or the wrongness of this? Should we be talking about the rightness or the wrongness of allowing gay people or trans people the full privileges of the church? And then once they talk about it and they debate it and hash it out, and they pray. I don't want to take prayer out of it because these are a very, these folks are very prayerful. But at the end of the day, they then vote. And in the Doctrine and Covenants, it talks about this process. They have to have unanimity. And if there is unanimity, then that's what becomes the revelation. It's not a passive thing where you're praying one day and God says, hey, ordain women to the priesthood. That's not how it works. And that's the biggest issue I've had run up against when I'm talking to more conservative or Orthodox Latter-day Saint crowds. They've been taught this church narrative for their entire lives that Spencer Kimball showed up to the temple one day on June 1st, said a prayer, and God miraculously told him to lift the ban. Complete and utter nonsense. He had been working so hard for this for months, indeed years. And when he prayed to the temple leading up to June 1st, it wasn't that, God, should I lift the ban? It was, God, help me to get others in the quorum to see that this is the right thing to do to move the work along. That's a fundamental difference. And some of the folks on the Saints Volume 4 that just came out that the church produced, I've been asked this repeatedly by many people about, what are your thoughts? And it doesn't surprise me, but I'm disappointed that the writers had given the traditional standard passive line that President Kimball showed up and there's when God spoke to him, because that's just not, it's not compatible with the evidence. But anyway, I'm being long-winded here, but the short answer is if there's a critical mass, that's when they get to talk about it. They notice the people pushing back on them, and then it may or may not lead to a change, but you can't make the change until you talk about it first. And right now, I know that they've been talking about LGBTQ issues because it's been in the news a lot. And some of the apostles have said things publicly about it, including Elder Holland. But, in my opinion, I don't have any basis on, but in my opinion, this is an interesting thing. And having read hundreds and hundreds of pages of their meeting minutes, not today's quorum, I don't have access to that, but, but it's not any different than, say, 40, 50, 60 years ago. I'm certain that they're talking about the pros and cons. If we allowed gay people to have the full privileges of the church, what would it do to the church? How would we have to change our theology? And, all of that. And I've been saying publicly for the longest time that one of the beauties of modern day revelation is you're not beholden to what your predecessors taught. You can change the doctrine because you're the sheriff, you're the president or the prophet. But yet, if you look at the leadership of the quorum, at least the decision makers in the quorum, Dallin Oaks and others, Russell Nelson, they're not going to lift the ban. But when you move into sort of the bottom tier of the quorum, you might see more inclusive voices. I don't know if it'll happen in my lifetime, but it will happen that queer people will be able to have the full rights and privileges of the church, because as the society at large becomes more secular that way and more permissive and open, that's when you'll see the church making changes. And I hope it's in my lifetime, but, I'm not going to bet on it.
Thank you. Landon, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah. Steph's been there a long time, and so let's go with that. And then let's go with Jen and Brian both have a question, and then we'll end after that.
Okay.
I'm playing a trick. I'm not Steph. I'm Steph's husband, Jory. But a quick question. So just real quick on the background. I'm an international attorney. And so when I run in, and I'm Exmo as well. But when I run into the church now, I run into the church more on a corporate or nonprofit stage more than the theological. My question was, to what extent did you perceive corporate or political objectives versus religious objectives in the fight to release the ban?
I didn't see corporate objectives. I mean, I never saw anything about the need to make money, the need to, bring in more tithing revenue. I didn't see that. Really, it's driven by this globalist vision. They really are trying to follow what they think the scriptures say, which is to bring the gospel to every kindred, nation, tongue, and people. And that was the conundrum of David O. McKay. After the Second World War, he's got this great vision where he wants to globalize the church. And they try to bring the church into Nigeria, as I write about in my book. And this is the first time that they've tried to open up a mission in a predominantly Black country in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's a disaster, right? Because the Nigerians, they want to run their own churches. They don't want white missionaries from Salt Lake, service missionaries coming there to do this. So it's a disaster. They learn it. They realize it's a disaster. But David O. McKay, just before he died, somebody asked him, what's your proudest accomplishment? And he said, I've been able to globalize the church. We have more temples. We have more of this, more of that. Spencer Kimball is part of that legacy. He sees what McKay's done, and he's trying to move that vision forward. So I don't see anything corporate with that at all. Not to say that it's not there, but it's just, I haven't seen any evidence. It's really driven by this globalist vision that he has.
Thank you.
Jen.
Yeah, thanks. Nice to be here. Thank you, Dr. Harris, for your book. I'm a Never Mormon here in Utah. I moved here in the 90s thanks to a Black friend who went to college with me, whose father features in your book. And I just want to thank you for including a lot of civil rights voices and also the perspective of people outside the church. And on that note, it's terrible enough. The priesthood ban is terrible enough for the members, but it also had broader effects throughout Utah and more broadly. So I wonder if you have a couple of examples or thoughts on that. And also, as a historian of the civil rights, if you can reflect quickly on the current moment we're in with all of this anti-DEI and other sort of the backlash swinging around again. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm rolling my eyes, Jen. It makes me ill. I'm not just a scholar of Mormonism. I teach civil rights. I teach African American history. I'm invested in this work. I've spent the better part of my adult life fighting racism, writing about it, teaching about it. I teach critical race theory. And it breaks my heart to see what I'm seeing today, how the certain government leaders have demonized Black and brown people. It's just open game. And what hurts me the most, I think, is when leaders are trying to normalize this, that it's okay to do this. It's never okay to do this. And we see so many ignorant people out there who take their cues from some of their government leaders. And, I think the people that bother me the most are the religious people who claim to follow the book and just zero empathy. I mean, I spend a lot of time with my students talking about that when you dehumanize people, when you see them something for which they're not, then you can do horrible things to them, whether it's immigrants at the border, whether it's slavery from the 18th century, whatever, whether it's Hitler and Jews, seeing them as ants. And so we talk a lot about the dehumanization of marginalized groups. And all I can do is give my students a tool set as they go into the world in their employment in their communities so that they can fight back against this stuff. With civil rights, in Utah in particular, it was important for me to include multiple voices in this book because even though a lot of people in the Black community in Utah were not LDS, they were affected by LDS racial doctrine insofar as they couldn't get homes, insofar as they were denied employment because of the color of their skin. And the predominantly Mormon legislature in the 1960s, they didn't want to move on it. They didn't want to pass a public accommodations bill that would allow or prevent discrimination in public housing.
Can I add to that? Sorry to interrupt, add to that quickly. My friend's father's name is Dr. Charles Neighbors. And when they moved to Utah, he was a doctor. And when they arrived, they had rented a place sight unseen. And when they showed up as a Black family, suddenly the unit was no longer available. So, but people came to their aid and the landlord relented and they actually were rented to. But he was a medical doctor in the 60s who was denied housing. So, and again, thanks for calling out Charles Neighbors. He's a name I hope everyone will look up.
Yeah, Charles Neighbors was a member of the NAACP, was a very significant voice in the Black community in and around Salt Lake. And he was one of I think it was Neighbors that I quote in my book when a New York Times reporter asked him, what do you think about Spencer Kimball lifting this doctrine, this priesthood ban? And Neighbors replied, I'll thank Spencer Kimball when he has a revelation that people won't discriminate against Black people in jobs and in housing, something like that. So he wasn't, in other words, happy that I guess he lifted the ban, but I want to see how it plays out with civil rights in Utah. And the idea, just to end on this note, that the brethren are absolutely terrified of interracial marriage. That's what's driving all of this. They want white employers and white landlords and all of that to be able to discriminate, because if you don't want the races to mix, then you want to give people the ability to keep them at arm's length. And thank goodness that the federal government intervened, and also other activists, including the NAACP, intervened to force the church to support civil rights protections in Utah. And as I write about in my book at length, I found dozens of really wonderful papers from the NAACP collection in Washington, D.C., in which they were giving the NAACP leaders in Ogden and Salt Lake counsel about what to do to pressure the church for change. And that was really revealing to me. And a number of those papers are in this book.
Thank you. Brian, last question.
All right. Thanks again, Matt. Appreciate your time with us. I guess my question is not necessarily specific just to your book, but those of us who are part of this book club, whether in or out of the church, feel pretty strongly about these issues, whether it's civil rights issues, LGBT issues, women's rights issues. And I think it's easy to look at the church right now that seems to be retrenching in some ways. The nation as a whole seems to be retrenching. And I'm asking your experience and expertise, both as a scholar and a historian, if you have any words for us that, is it all hopeless, or is there reasons to be hopeful and encouraged? I know that's a big question, but I thought it would be an appropriate one kind of to end on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, we have to be hopeful, right, Brian? Because if we're not hopeful, we're left with gloom and despair. And I think that we have to do things to protect our mental health. I mean, for me, I'm aware of what's going on, but I've taken a step back a little bit just to keep my mental health sharp and where it needs to be, because it just disheartens me to no end to see that Black and brown people and gay people are just open season. It just violates every core of my being. And so how I fight against this is that I use my privilege as a scholar and as somebody who's been fortunate enough to study all of this. So obviously my students in my classrooms and in the classes that I teach, my communities, I mean, my students hear this often about real life experiences at the gym. I remember I was at my local gym working out one day, and this 70-year-old MAGA guy comes over to me. I don't know what it is about these folks. They're just drawn to me. I guess I'm a nice guy, but I pride myself on being able to get along with different people. And anyway, so Jerry comes over to me, the 70-year-old MAGA guy, and did you know what they're doing in the schools? They're teaching children. What was that little fad? They're teaching them that it's okay to be trans, or the teachers are pushing all this stuff. And I told Jerry, I said, Jerry, I'm in schools quite a bit because I work with educators, but I'm never authoritative. At least I try not to be. And what I told Jerry, I said, Jerry, why would they do that? Teachers have so many responsibilities. They have so many different learners. They have behavioral issues they have to deal with. They have children who have mental health issues they have to deal with. They have different students with different cognitive abilities. They have teacher tests that their students have to score well on to keep their jobs. And you really think they're taking precious classroom time teaching these kids that they ought to be trans? Jerry, does that make sense to you? And he doesn't know what to say. Just simple Socratic questions, right? And, I think he walked away, and I know I gave him something to think about. But in other words, you really ought to think and ask critical questions when you're spoon-fed this nonsense. That why would teachers do this? They have nothing to gain by sexualizing their classrooms and everything to lose. But yet, I'll tell you this, maybe this isn't a hopeful note, Brian, and I apologize. I mean, we all have to remain engaged in this fight. That's the hopeful part. And I think we can each do good in our own communities that way. But the hard part, as a scholar, as I look at these things, is that what's killing our country is what I call cheap speech. that our speeches, because of the First Amendment, we have the most permissive First Amendment laws in the world. And that's a good thing in many ways, but it's also harming us. That we can lie without impunity about an election being stolen. We can lie about this or that, and there's no consequence. Right now, social media is, for all intents and purposes, unregulated. We ought to have some common sense laws that would tell people if they're seeing some algorithm, it's produced by some Russian bot. But we don't know this. And so too many of our fellow Americans are buying this stuff from social media that to this point has been unregulated. And it's just the propaganda is outrageous. You know, Haitians eating dogs. That's the kind of stuff we're dealing with. And I'm sad to say, I don't see any change in the near future as long as we don't regulate that sort of speech that's harmful to us in our democracy. But I know that if we continue to work in our communities, to educate our family members, our friends, our neighbors, and most critically, write your elected representatives when there's a policy that you don't agree with. They need to hear our collective voices. And just like the brethren, when they hear a critical mass, they do make changes. They do listen. There's the first rule, and Summer Rain will agree with this. The first rule of politics is to, maybe she wouldn't agree with this. The first rule of politics is to keep your job, right? You want to keep your constituents happy. And, you know, so if you've got a critical mass of people writing their local representatives saying, look, I saw how there's a vote coming up, and I don't think you ought to support this bill. It's a bad bill. And if enough people do that, then that person's going to listen. And here's hopeful. I know that there are some Republicans today who are pushing back on some issues that soon-to-be President Trump says he's going to advance. And that gives me hope that there are Republicans who are trying to do the right thing. And that makes me happy. And I hope that, you know, that makes you happy too.
All right. Hey, Matt, we really appreciate your time, your book. I've got to say, you know, the thing that I guess from the book as I read and as I listened to this discussion, the thing that was probably the hardest for me to internalize and recognize why I was having such a problem. But the first one is that it seemed like when the church says they're honest as they know how to be, that was very challenged in this book, as I find they knew they were lying about that at BYU. I saw how many times they would not let people into the archives and the books to get the information that they needed in order to find out this stuff. So that was difficult. And the other thing is, it seemed like anyone who walked the party line, even when they knew it wasn't right, was rewarded. You know, you have Wilkinson, who has the athletic place named after him there. But Benyon doesn't. You know, the guys who were right and the guys who stood up for what was right, they never get anything. In fact, they often got punished and excommunicated. Hubie Brown being demoted and whatnot, and that was discouraging. But I think what you said about critical mass, you know, it's up to us. We are the critical mass. Most of the people in this group, that you're willing to stand up and say, hey, there's things that still aren't right, and even if I'm out or I've left, I'm still going to speak up that this isn't right. And I think this book showed the importance of that if you keep doing what's right or what you think is right, eventually it gets changed. And I think that's the hope that the book gave me as we discuss that. And I do want to say thank you, because Matt, you had the publisher send us a copy. I got my copy before you did. And I got it before John DeLynn did. So John actually borrowed this book. That 40 hours of time that you did came from this book. And so John signed it, and I'm looking forward to getting you to sign it. I was trying to get, when you were here in Salt Lake, to get you to sign it. But I tried not to mark it up because I said, wow, this has some history. But I couldn't. As I got into it, I just had to start marking it up. So it was just so good. So thank you so much, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Landon, for that. I'd be happy to sign your book. Just let me take a quick plug. In April, I think it's the Dialogue Foundation sponsoring a panel at the University of Utah. So those of you who live in Utah, in April, I think you have to register for it, but there'll be a panel discussion on these topics. Myself, Paul Reeve, and a woman named Alice Birch will be there, three of us. So be happy to sign your books if you're there. If you live in the Northern California area, the same panel. So we've got 2 speaking engagements, one in April for you, and then the other one in Atherton, California on, let's see, I'm looking at my calendar here. It's on January 25th. So it's coming right up. So if you live in Northern California and you want to come, we'd love to have you there.
If you can send us the details, we'll put that on the episode so that people can go see that in the show notes. So
yeah, I'd be happy to. There's a promotional brochure that's already out, so I can get that to you, Landon.
Whew, that was a lot. And I hope that you guys really enjoyed it. I thought it was a powerful discussion. I thought it was an incredible discussion. I mean, I've been reading the book, studying the book, and I learned way more than I even, I didn't think there was more to learn is what I'm trying to say. But in talking to Matt, there's more, right? There's always more.
I'm always afraid, are we going to run out of questions and have to backfill? Literally within about the first minute or two after we open it up, everyone who asked the question had already raised their hand. So they were waiting for literally almost 2 hours to get their questions out. That's how pivotal this book was. And if you have not read this book, it is a must read. It is just fascinating. And the level of detail that he goes into and the scholarship that went into finding the information he had is just top notch. Excellent book.
Yep, it's true. And I think I've told it before about Matt, but I'll tell it again just at the end of this, how he explained to us how he does his research. When people do research, it's like a Thanksgiving dinner, right? There are different levels of the categories of things that go into a Thanksgiving dinner. And a lot of researchers are happy with, the mashed potatoes or the gravy or the salad, meaning it's sort of a secondary source or, it's something that isn't right there at the heart of it. And that's fine. A lot of researchers do very well writing with that. But Matt's like, unless I get the turkey, and by the turkey he means original notes, recordings from meetings, original statements, those kinds of things, he goes, I won't even take on the project unless I get the turkey. So this book is a turkey. I hope no one clips that soundbite, right? That doesn't sound good. This book is a turkey, but you know what I mean? You know what he means, right, Landon?
Oh yeah, I mean, he was talking with Spencer W. Kimball's son, who is also his biographer, and getting notes from him that were from his father. He also was getting original sources from the BYU library, from Wilkinson, and his notes of what went on at the time. So he has a lot of original sources, very well documented.
And you can tell because, it's such a window, as I said before, into the inner workings of the church at that time. I almost can't believe that I'm able to pull back that curtain and see it and get as mad as I get. But you feel that way. And we should point out that this book is coming out on audio, because right now it's only, hard copy, which I think maybe is deterred some people that just don't have time, but only have time for audiobooks. This will be out in February. I'm not exactly sure of the date, but I think, it's already been incredibly well received. And I think once it hits audio, I think that's going to break it open as far as everybody being able to listen and get this information, which is it's just groundbreaking. We've never heard anything like this before.
Yep, it's worth the read, every minute of it. I couldn't put it down.
Well, no, that's not true, Landon, because sometimes you put it down in terms of throwing it down.
Yeah, so I did get upset
angry
sometimes
about what you were hearing in the book. So yes, you don't voluntarily put it down, but you may go, yeah, exactly. Like I said, it peels back that curtain. So anyway, we hope that you guys all enjoyed this good book club meeting, and it kind of gives you an idea of how we operate. So again, we'd love to invite anybody to come join us. You really don't even have to have read the book. Most of us do, but if you can't, it's just fun to be part of that discussion. And we'll put some links in the show notes. Very easy to join. We have a Facebook page or an emailing list, and we'll give you the book list, and you just zoom in with us every second Sunday of the month.
And if you can't attend, we put every book club meeting, we have a podcast that we put out, the book club meetings, so you can attend even if you can't make it to the actual meeting. You can always watch, and so you can read the book and follow along, or just listen about what the book was about. So
yep, and that's true. We have an audio podcast for the Good Book Club that you can search, and we have a YouTube channel. If you look up the Good Book Club for Post Mormons, like Lana said, we record everything, so you guys can catch up if you want. But, the Good Book Club is how Landon and I connected and what we've been doing for 5 years, and it morphed into Mormonish. I think I've talked about this before because we started having these authors on and we're like, well, this is amazing. Why don't we try to start something else where we can talk to these authors and, dig a little deeper, get a little more content. So Mormonish actually kind of spun out. We're a spinoff, aren't we, Landon?
We are.
We're a spinoff from the Good Book Club. Yeah, it'll always be our baby, right? Our first little thing that we started, but we love it. It's deconstruction through reading, and the reading is through the lens of Mormonism, and it's extremely helpful. And like I said, super smart people. A lot of you guys are in the book club, and I mean that, super smart. So anyway, thanks for watching. Please comment. Have you read Second Class Saints? Are you looking forward to the audiobook coming out? We'd love to hear all of your thoughts and comments. It's such an important book. Like I said, there's a reason John DeLynn has covered it. So many other podcasters. We can't stress enough how important it is to understand the church in that era and all of those issues. So please comment and let us know what you think. If you'd like to subscribe to Mormonish Podcast, you can do that. And we'd also, if you'd like to be made aware of when new episodes come out, you can hit the notification bell. If you would like to make a donation to Mormonish Podcast, we also have links in the show notes always to a donor box where you can do that. We are a nonprofit and we really appreciate everybody that does. You guys are just so awesome. We have links in the show notes also to our merch store where you can pick up a mug or a hat. And again, just thank you all so much. Thank you, Landon, for co-hosting this. And thank you for running the Good Book Club in my absence today when we originally
Your abscess.
My abscess. Thank you. Yeah, that's a dad joke that I don't really appreciate right now, given that I'm loaded on Percocet. So thank you, Landon. All right. We'll see y'all next time on Mormonish. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.